Hello, my name is Paul Michael Taylor, and I'm curator for Asia, Europe, and the Middle East at the Anthropology Department of the Smithsonian Institution and head of our Asian Cultural History program. And as part of our series of lectures for this important conference celebrating the anniversary of Indonesia's Museum Association, we're talking about examples of exhibitions, and I wish I could take you on a tour of our exhibition. We don't currently have an exhibition up about Indonesia, and in fact, our museum is still largely closed because of the pandemic, and so we only have timed ticketed entries for some of the halls. And consequently, I'm going to take you on a tour of a virtual show instead, which you can visit yourself anytime on the web, about an important historical expedition that took place to Papua in 1926. It was organized and planned by an American named Matthew Stirling, and he was associated with the Smithsonian. And he gathered up his own group of funders and people accompanying him. He didn't have a Smithsonian staff position, but the Smithsonian helped in many ways and was the beneficiary of the collections and the archives and the photographs that resulted. But it was a big, complex New Guinea expedition. And the Dutch East Indies government was very concerned about having an American expedition and insisted that it should be a joint expedition. So the Dutch actually contributed a very large amount to this expedition, which we can say was the joint Dutch and Smithsonian expedition to Papua. It got its name from the lecture tour, which Matthew Stirling gave it after his return. He titled the lecture tour "By Aeroplane to Pygmyland," and that's a great old-fashioned title. It was the first expedition to use an airplane to explore New Guinea. And by including Pygmyland in the title, it illustrates the importance in the 1920s for people to try to reach this area of so-called pygmy or short-statured people that were in the highlands of New Guinea. So these are not contemporary goals in anthropology, but this was the source of an important expedition and an important scholarly expedition and scientific research that took place both on the Dutch and American side. And I feel that this publication, which we launched in 2006, an anniversary, obviously, of the expedition, is a good example of how we can take a multiplicity of different sources and assemble them into a research publication that has a multimedia format. You can find this expedition on the website of the Smithsonian Institution Libraries. You can search for it at the sil.si.edu or the si.edu site, and I'll show the link later. This is a home page, and the central image is flashed, so it can be moving different ones sometimes over time. But you can see that we've divided the site into basically four parts. I want to call attention to the top right, expedition source material. That's a wide range of source materials. And I think you will maybe find this case inspiring for expeditions, archaeological discoveries, and so on, which often have a huge amount of data to them. And how do you organize so much data? At the lower, moving clockwise now from the lower right, about this project describes how we got started on it and what is the nature of the kind of ongoing research on Papua, which this project represents. Browse photos and films, and I'll show you some examples of this, allows people to go through and look through the records of the expeditions, the photos, the film footage from 1926, original film footage, and the various written accounts in a number of different ways so that you can browse them in several different ways. And last, interpretive essays. I say last, but they're also at the top left, so you could say that first. And actually, I like the idea that people might be interested in reading the interpretive essays first. But really, we knew that just like some physical exhibitions, people would go in any direction and just decide for themselves what they want to do. So if you're interested in a specific place on the Mamberamo River, which this expedition went to, you can actually use your cursor along the map of the expedition and go directly to that site, find out all the different things that were recorded in different people's diaries, all the photos from there and any film footage from there, and just focus on that. It's a lot of different ways to use the same material. But the interpretive essays include a kind of general introduction that I wrote to the overall project and why it's important to revisit historical expeditions and historical records like this, even though their fundamental assumptions about the differences among people, about the nature of societies that they were visiting and so on are quite different from the ones we hold today, but they are historically very important. And it also it gives you an overview of the different types of collections and data that results. And it sort of looks back and reassesses the situation of the land and people of Western New Guinea, of what has become Papua from that time to the present, and how this period of time and this particular expedition fit in the overall trajectory of that important part of the Republic of Indonesia. So let's look at first the types of expedition source materials I mentioned. One is the diaries. This is a page from the diary of the American head of the expedition, Matthew Stirling. And so one of my first tasks was to carefully transcribe this diary and to make sure that we were able to read it correctly, including his own transcription where he made some changes and his own later writings where he made some changes in what he was saying. So we're looking at the different sources and how they compare with each other, but the basis, an important basis, is his diary and other diaries. So we have also completely transcribed the expedition diary of Hamer, the other American traveling on this expedition. The diary itself also includes little illustrations that he himself made. So those have to be preserved alongside the text. And he had had some people presumably type up his diary where he made some annotations on that typed version in the past that he was planning, he said, to publish, but he never did actually publish them. Then we have graphic material such as his old maps. Of course, we have photographs. We have a large number of photographs. And here I will say is one of the greatest contributions of this particular project is sorting out those photographs. I will mention that Stirling himself, after completing this expedition, after turning over all this data to the Smithsonian, went on to become the so-called father of Olmec archaeology, focusing on the Olmec people of historic archaeological area of Mexico and Central America. So he never went back to New Guinea and never really followed up very much on this type of research, although he supported this kind of research by other people when he later became in the American institutional setting of the Smithsonian. However, during World War II, America, including all of its scientific institutions, really had a very full-scale war effort. I mean, everybody who could contribute to the war pretty much had to. Inside the Smithsonian as well, many of the exhibition halls were closed down, and they became opened up as with lots of little desks and so on, and they became office spaces that the Pentagon could use, the Defense Department could use for clerks typing things and so on. Anybody who could do anything for the war was mobilized, however you could do it. So there wasn't much need for archaeologists of the Olmec, but the Pacific theater of the war included Western New Guinea, and the armed forces of the United States had a program to develop information booklets about a lot of topics that would be relevant to fighting the war in the Pacific. There was, of course, one on the peoples of the Dutch East Indies. There was one on peoples of Indochina. There was one on things like snakes of the Philippines and all kinds of different topics. And so Matthew Stirling was told he should just give up his archaeology for now, join the war effort, and he has to write a book about the peoples of New Guinea. For that purpose, he wrote everywhere, and people who had been Dutch anthropologists and so on in exile sent whatever they could, copied their photographs, and he accumulated huge numbers of photographs from other people. This was maybe good for purposes of writing his book, but it made our job very hard because he wasn't that concerned about keeping all these photographs separate. So one of my first tasks was to go through and separate all out, try to figure out which photographs he got from other people that were not even from his expedition, which in the end turned out not to be that hard, but it was just time consuming and we had to confirm it. And the physical character of the photographs, the type of information on them, the envelopes they were in, all of these things made it possible. But certainly a lot of people imagined that some of those photographs from Merauke and so on, these were from his expedition. They were not. He never got near Merauke. This was an expedition primarily through the Moluccas by his ship, where they stopped a few times to Biak, and then went to the mouth of the Mamberamo River, up the Mamberamo, and then from the Rouffaer tributary up the Rouffaer River, and then walked from there up to the Ren or Dem Highlands, which is in Highland New Guinea near the Dani people, for example. So that is the region that's covered. And it was quite clear that a lot of his photographs are not from that region. I myself have been to some of these places, including doing films in some of these places, and been among the Dani somewhat, and also particularly I did a film among the Korowai and the Fayu people. Fayu are on a tributary of the Rouffaer. We also find things in unusual places. So this is with his shipping records, but as you see, it's actually still unpublished, I have to say, word list of one of the languages that he came across. And he also assembled big collections. Now here is where I have to interject something about the history of collecting in anthropology and anthropology museums, very briefly, because I do talk about this in other seminars much more. But in anthropology, in the 19th century, collections of material culture from around the world were very, very important, primarily because the main theoretical or conceptual foundation of the science of mankind, the anthropology, was based on the concept of evolution and evolution of societies. So beginning with around 1900, Franz Boas, particularly in the United States, and others really argued against this idea that you could use the advanced level of material culture to consider that as sort of proxy for the degree of advancement of a society. Saying, for example, that it's true that Australian Aborigines have very undeveloped material culture, but they have a magnificently developed mythological system, symbolic system, language, literature, oral literature, and so on. And so evolution was also recognized as something that seemed to enforce or underlie a stratification of societies that enabled colonialism. And so evolution was largely abandoned as a theoretical construct of importance in favor of other things. And with that, the importance that material culture played in anthropology became much less for a long time. And you can see that when you look at different countries and graph the percentage of scientific papers in anthropology journals that are partially or wholly about material culture. And you find that they reached their highest point in this period between, in the US, you can see on the lowest level, between 1900 and 1909. And then by the 1950s and 60s, they were at their lowest level. Now, after this time, people started discovering new interpretations of how material culture could be used, which is where we are now. So the growth in interest in ethnographic or cultural material from throughout the world has tremendously increased. But it was much higher before Matthew Stirling's time. And by the time Matthew Stirling deposited his collections assembled in the 1920s, very few people were actually doing research on material culture for any kind of serious scientific studies. So collections languished, and so did a lot of the other data that he collected. And that's not unusual for collections worldwide from Indonesia, from New Guinea, from elsewhere for that period. So that timing was not right for the kind of scientific studies that he expected to be done. And similarly, the study of races and racial differences underwent huge transformations after the 1930s and after World War II, and the implications of the role of race that Nazi Germany had, for example. But at the time, it was widely expected that there would be some relationship between the societal evolution and the study of somatic characteristics or bodily characteristics. And so that, plus the fact that people wanted to understand the nature of pygmies and where they came from and so on, all led to a large number of photographic and other measurements of the characteristics of the body, including skull measurements, for living people. So that was a big effort that was taking place on this expedition. All of these things are of historic interest, but people have not really explored any method, have rediscovered any method to make some of these kinds of data useful, given that the theoretical constructions for which they were gathered are quite different today. The collections themselves, nevertheless, were divided, and you can see this in his journal entry, Matthew Stirling's journal entry from August 2nd, 1926. I worked all afternoon dividing the collections and labeling them. Is because he wanted to divide up the collections. Some would go to the Netherlands, that Dutch collections then would be divided, some staying in Batavia and some going to Netherlands and being distributed to other European museums, and the northern portion going to the United States. The key people were just a small number of key people, but they represented, something that was the size of a small village that you could do a real ethnography of. And this is the kind of data that you could use to do such an ethnography. Stirling and Hedberg were the primary two Americans who kept diaries throughout this period. And so we have gotten a lot of information from those two diaries. And then the leaders of the Dutch expeditions, but in the Dutch also had military and other leaders, but Dr. van Leeuwen was a botanist who made huge contributions to botany. He had left his position at Bogor to the botanical garden there to participate in this expedition. An orchid expert, but interested in all types of botanical collecting. Then there were large numbers of other Indonesian peoples. a very large Dayak population. Anji Pui is shown here as one example. But these were the people who were brought to New Guinea in order to row the long canoes, make the canoes, row the canoes, build houses, and so on. And a big group of soldiers for protection, but also to keep everybody in line there, including the Malay convicts. These are people from Sumatra and Java who were convicts who were brought along for purposes of, carrying things and cooking and cleaning and so on. So this was their convict duty, was to participate in the expedition. So we had, a whole kind of group of a village level group of people from different parts of Indonesia brought together and dropped into a Papuan setting in which you had Papuans also interacting. It was a very, very interesting phenomenon in the 1920s. Now, among the types of data that we have are these early films that were done. There's not a lot of filming that is done because it was a very complex, difficult process to make a film. But at one point in June, the entire community lines up, and you have all the major Dutch and American people shown in a film. This is the film selection number 8. The reason we selected these groups, small groups of films, is because the filming was done for short periods throughout the length of the expedition. But what we have done is you can either watch the film from beginning to end, which you're welcome to do on the website, or as I mentioned, if you're looking for information about just one particular place, you can go to all the information so that you can read a person's diary, Matthew Stirling's diary or Stanley Hedberg's diary, from beginning to end without interruption. Or you can say, I would only like to look at the mouth of the Mamberamo River and what was happening there as they first arrived in New Guinea, and look at everything from there, the collections, the film footage, the measurements of people, the diary entries, and so on from just that one place. That's how we've tried to organize this. And you do suggest this as an example where you have lots of different kind of data from a big project and you want to make it useful. Find a couple of ways that people can usefully look at the whole thing, watch the whole film from beginning to end, read the whole diary from beginning to end, and so on. But you can't really arrange to do that with photographs as well, but you can associate the photos with groups and have people go through each group, but it's unlikely anybody will get that much out of it that way. So you find some examples that can be watched from beginning to end, but others you group into sections so that you can place them with like material from that area. So this is just one section of film. If you go to the June 10th, let's say you want to know what happened on June 10th, just because maybe you found an artifact with a date of when it was collected, or whatever reason. So you can read Matthew Stirling's journal just from that date. And he writes here, LaRue took a couple of short films. It was with his panorama camera. Panorama camera gives you a very long view so that the print comes out as a long one. Dick, meaning Dick Peck, the person who was their photographer, took movies of the crowd. He says at 8 o'clock this morning, practically the whole expedition, staff, convicts, soldiers, and Dayaks were lined up and photographed. So the diary entry refers then to the film selection. We do not have access to the panorama images. I have seen one when I was in the Netherlands, but those are stored in archives in the Netherlands. And here's the journey of Stanley Hedberg. So it was cloudy most of the morning. LaRue had the entire outfit, soldiers, convicts, Dayaks, and the staff lined up for a picture with his panorama camera. Dick got movies of it. So there we see that it was LaRue's idea to make everybody line up because he wanted to use his panorama camera. And Dick JPEG, having a movie camera, decided, okay, I'll go ahead and do the film at the same time. So we reference the film from that same day. And this, if you go to the section headings, is what you would see. It's section 8 from the original 1926 film footage. And let's just take a look at it.
Some of the 400 members of the expedition are here shown assembled at Albatross Camp. Ambonese soldiers, Dyaks, and the scientific members and military members of the expedition. Hedberg, Stirling, Van Leeuwen, Captain Posthumus, Lieutenant Jordans, Hans Hoyt, the pilot, Prince Hamer, the mechanic. Number of the Siberi Papuans occasionally visited camp.
So moving on, then we step back to look at the Stirling so-called New Guinea expedition fostered by the Smithsonian Institution. That was a carefully worded way of saying it. Stirling was very anxious to get a lot of publicity from this. He wanted the expedition basically to pay for itself. And particularly Hedberg was the publicist brought on for that purpose. And it's quite interesting, the economics of the whole thing, which is not my subject here. But what we can say is that we have to keep it in mind, even if we're looking at the scientific data that resulted, because the economics of it did kind of inform some of the way information was recorded. And we can see, for example, that Hedberg particularly kind of posed some images and some activities that took place among Papuans, where they were tasting some of the fuel oil and smiling and laughing and so on. And he was intending to use the film footage or the photographic footage of such events as advertising that would sell the fuel oil later. And this is a very early kind of example of what we now call public-private partnerships in organizing expeditions and the activities of museums. The Smithsonian was a little bit horrified by some of the activities that took place and some of the publicity that this expedition got. And immediately after this expedition was over, set up a new kind of system for scientific activities of any kind that were going to have publicity associated with it, so that the Smithsonian would have to approve the publicity in the meantime. But that was not the case at the time of this expedition. So live and learn, and some of the publicity I'll be showing you will see what I'm talking about in just a moment. But here is basically a very posed-looking PR photo. The fact that he named the Stirling Expedition on his plane, and this idea of juxtaposing the most advanced technology. There's things like the phonographic recordings of traditional music, or the plane that's exploring New Guinea, juxtaposed with the most primitive people in the world in New Guinea, was very much an image that he was looking for, and an image of, we can say, kind of American and Western technological superiority that was reinforced again and again in his lecture tour afterward by Aeroplane to Pygmyland. Here's the example I mentioned of Papuans tasting fuel oil, which was intended for use in advertising later. And images like this, where tribal people are enjoying the aeronautical digest, we can say probably designed as advertisements in that same magazine. So the net result, though, is that we have a very large number of photographs, a very large amount of daily writing by all the people on the expedition. And that's what forms the expedition source materials that you see. As for browsing photos and films, here we see a couple of things here in this example. As you go through or browse or read from beginning to end any of the diary entries, I have tried to very carefully edit those. So doctors van Leeuwen, you see here in line 4, it's sick equals doctors. Often there's a misspelling, Macassar instead of Macassar. When you see this highlighted, who was van Leeuwen? What is Macassar and what does it mean? There's 70 Dyaks. What is this term Dyaks? Dyaks was at the time an acceptable English spelling for what's now spelled D-A-Y-A-K, Dayak. So that's why it's not corrected there as a sick. If you click on any of those, you will get an explanation. So this is basically how we do a lot of annotations and footnotes throughout the text. And here is another example of that. Then the notes will be listed for the date of the note and keyword, and see where just now it says our head camp is highlighted. There's a note here, head camp, also abbreviated as HC by Hedberg, later broken into 2 separate camps along the Rouffaer River, lower and upper head camp, etc. So it describes what the head camp was. So basically, this is the kind of internal organization of the project, which for every journal entry included the references to things that happened either in the text or photographs that were taken there and so on. And so that we can later make a reference in an index to wherever these items occur. So if you want to find out about who are the people of Bisano, what happened at Albatross Camp, you can go to our index and get a full range of topics. Then there was the research to determine what was in these photographs. Sometimes you only have the photograph, but then other times you find that local press has published what's on it, or we can figure out from neighboring photographs what's happening. And here you see that the Aeron, their airplane, which they brought, is being loaded onto the deck of this boat Fomalhaut at Surabaya, in order to be taken through the Moluccas and then offloaded at the mouth of the Mamberamo River at their base, at their camp there. And so we recognize this from their April 9th, they're starting the expedition. They're in Surabaya, and he's describing how they get the Aeron on board, how to get the aviation gas together on board, and so on, what to do about foodstuffs and tools. They had to get another ship to take those, and so on. But when we used the photograph in one version of the diary, we have for each photograph a kind of quote that's taken from the text. Why do we do that? Because this is actually a very nice old sort of 1920s, 1930s custom that you'd show in an old book, you know, that you can still find these beautifully bound old books. You'd show an illustration, hand drawn or a photograph, and then there would be a quote from the story about what was that nature of that person or what was happening in the photograph. So we just repeated that custom, so that from the photograph, you can click on the photograph and get lots of different information about where we found it, what was written on the back of it, if anything, and so on, what number it had, if it was one of the numbers photographs. That's one kind of information. But if you're just reading through, and you don't want to bother clicking on that, and you're not interested in the archival data, then we still try to make it an enjoyable read from beginning to end. Okay, so source material we've covered, and getting back to the different types that I showed you earlier, I think we've covered all of these now, but what I do want to mention is that there are particular ways to transcribe these. Maybe we don't have time to talk about those today, but ways to check your transcription and ways to check the accuracy of what you're recording. So basically, our records go back to the original data that we have, and they have become a kind of example for many other types of publication, I would say. So when our team launched this project in 2006, we launched it in Leiden at the Museum of Volkenkunde. It was called now the Museum of World Cultures in Leiden. And on the way there, we visited nearby in Ypres, Belgium, the Museum of the In Flanders Field Museum about World War I. There's a region in which there was trench warfare in World War I, and there in Belgium, near Leiden, where we launched this. And fighters from all sides, the Dutch, the British, the French, the Americans, Germans, were in different trenches, and they were never sure what was happening in the other trenches, how far they could get if they charged, and so on. They were keeping diaries. You have numerous diaries from different people with different perspectives. When you have such a project and such a record, this type of arrangement can be very useful. And so we talked about it there and invited people from there also to our launch. I recommend it also for other types of expeditions, other types of archaeological digs, and data-rich projects. So this is how we conclude the kind of overview of the site, and the web address, as I said, is www.sil.si.edu/expedition/1926. So that will show up on your slide in a moment. Thank you all for your attention, and I hope you have a chance to enjoy this website sometime when you have time.